Before we start, I'd like to remind you that simultaneous translators are available on the registration table. If you need them, please request them at the registration table. As the agenda goes, we will first have a presentation by Mr. Jayadi PhD, Executive Director, Scientific Research and Consulting, with the title of The Politics of Extremism, continued by the presentation by Dr. Matthew J. Wings, Assistant Professor, St. Louis University, USA, and moderated by Mr. Burhanuddin Muhtadi, PhD, Executive Director, Jakarta Politik Indonesia, with the title Conducting Surveys on Religious and Non-Religious Extremism, followed by a Q&A session and conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Jayadi Hanan. Mr. Hanan, you may have the floor.
Saya sendiri aja, nggak enak sendirian. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Salam dikasih di rumah. Saya cek dua soalnya. Mancing. Bapak Ibu, saya tahu Anda semua menunggu sesinya Dr. Matthew. Ya, so for Mr. Matthew, please bear with me a bit, about 10 to 15 minutes. It will be up in a minute. Saya nggak tahu kenapa saya disuruh, apa sih tujuan saya bicara ini sebetulnya. Tapi Dr. Philip yang nyuruh saya bicara. Nah, yang pasti kalau ibarat konser itu kan ada band utama, band pembuka, penyanyi utama, penyanyi pembuka. Nah, saya ini penyanyi pembuka untuk yang siang hari lah, gitu. Sebelum Pak Matthew memainkan, menyanyikan suaranya. Saya punya 5 slide. Slide pertama ini, slide terakhir ucapan thank you. jadi ya cuma 3 slide aja. Apa yang ingin saya bicarakan isinya ada di itu sebetulnya, ada yang di draft, tapi tidak apa-apa. Karena sudah disuruh pilih, ya sudah lah saya bicara. Pertama, saya kira salah satu problem utama tadi sudah mengemuka terus-menerus adalah bagaimana kita mendefinisikan, mengkonseptualisasikan ekstremisme. Di sini saya menampilkan salah satu definisi yang mungkin agak luas sehingga bisa masuk ke berbagai tempat gitu. Nah, pertama begini, mengapa disebut the politics of extremism, politik ekstremisme? Karena banyak cara kita untuk melihat persoalan ekstremisme itu. Tapi saya kira salah satu cara yang makin populer dan tampaknya makin relevan untuk kita lakukan adalah melihat ekstremisme sebagai sesuatu yang terkait dengan politik atau sesuatu yang berdimensi politik, sehingga kita tidak bisa melepaskan aspek politik dari ekstremisme itu. Ada memang dulu misalnya yang beranggapan bahwa ekstremisme terjadi karena persoalan irasionalitas. Orang melakukan ekstremitas karena irasional. Tapi kan pandangan itu makin berkurang, dan kalau kita lihat berbagai literatur, pandangan bahwa politik itu yang politik sebagai aspek yang penting untuk melihat ekstremisme itu makin banyak digunakan. Nah, di sini saya tidak langsung masuk ke violent ekstremismenya, tetapi contoh definisi ini menurut saya cukup luas untuk membantu kita memahami secara lebih luas ekstremisme. Pertama, ekstremisme dapat kita pandang, salah satu cara mengkonseptualisasikannya adalah pandangan atau cara pandang tentang sejumlah isu atau masalah yang sangat jauh dari pandangan orang banyakan atau mainstream. Posisinya sangat jauh dari mainstream. Dulu kalau Anda yang hidup di Orde Baru mengenal istilah EKI, ekstrem kanan, ekstrem kiri, tapi jadi dimensinya bisa kiri kanan. bisa juga ekstrim liberal misalnya 10 kalau pakai istilah Philip, atau ekstrim konservatif yang satu itu. Tapi dimensi juga bisa terkait dengan isu lain. Misalnya kita mengenal ada istilah ultranasionalisme. Ada sekelompok orang yang memiliki pandangan nasionalisme yang berlebihan sehingga semua orang lain yang tidak menjadi bagian dari mereka dianggap tidak boleh. Jadi pertama, ekstremisme bisa dilihat sebagai satu cara pandang atau bagaimana orang memandang sesuatu, dan itu bisa dikaitkan dengan yang ekstrim, kiri kanan atau dimensi-dimensi lain. Mungkin itu bisa membantu kita para surveyor ketika kita melakukan sebelum kita membuat bisnis kostum ya, lalu indikator dan sebagainya. Ekstremisme bisa juga berarti metode yang ekstremis atau metode yang ekstrim, yaitu cara atau metode ekstrim untuk mencapai tujuan. Nah, ini biasanya bisa berbentuk teror, kekerasan atau teror. Jadi definisinya bisa pertama cara pandang atau metodenya ekstrim. Nah, yang ketiga ini mungkin yang sudah mulai banyak kita lakukan, bahwa ada, maksud saya sangat yakin dengan posisi mungkin bisa disebut sebagai fanatik begitu, sangat fanatik dengan posisi dan keyakinannya, dan pada saat yang bersamaan tidak bisa mentolerir adanya perbedaan dalam kelompok. Gitu. Jadi by definisi dimungkinkan orang sangat fanatik dengan pandangannya, tapi masih mungkin juga ada toleran dengan orang lain. Meskipun biasanya jarang, kalau sangat fanatik posisinya akan sulit untuk mentolerir pihak lain. Ini mungkin beberapa cara pandang konseptualisasi ekstremisme yang mungkin bisa salah satu yang bisa dipakai, karena kita semua sadar bahwa banyak sekali definisi tentang ekstremisme ini, termasuk violent extremism. Dan seringkali ekstremisme ini saya kira kita semua yang belajar politik atau politik sosial secara umum yang mendalami ini di-confuse, dibingungkan dengan istilah-istilah ekstremisme di satu sisi, radikalisme, radikalisasi, kemudian juga terorisme. Tiga istilah itu seringkali dipakai secara berganti-ganti dan kadang-kadang secara kadang-kadang kita menganggap sesuatu yang sama. Nah, itu menurut saya ya perlu kita hati-hati ketika teman-teman atau kita semua mencoba untuk melakukan survei terkait dengan konsep yang ingin kita capai, ingin kita lakukan. Kalau ini ekstremisme, penjelasan mengenai apa itu ekstremisme, aktivitas atau pandangannya. Lalu ekstremis adalah dengan demikian orang atau kelompok yang memiliki pandangan ekstrim atau cara-cara ekstrim dalam mencapai tujuannya, atau sangat tidak toleran terhadap adanya perbedaan. Gitu. Makanya kan kalau kita di Indonesia yang tiga ini yang lebih banyak kita eksplorasi saat ini. Soal toleransi dan sebagainya. Oke, saya mencoba melihat definisi ekstremisme atau pengertian mengenai ekstremisme, menawarkan salah satu konsep yang menurut saya cukup luas dipakai. Nah, sekarang kalau ekstremisme dipandang dari politik, maka menurut saya ada dua aspek di sini. Kalau ekstremisme dilihat dari sudut politik, atau the politics of extremism itu mengandung dua aspek atau dua hal. Yang pertama adalah kita melihat ekstremisme sebagai sesuatu yang bersifat politik atau tujuannya politik. Yang kedua, bisa ya? Udah, kita selesai. Yang kedua adalah sebab-sebab politik dari ekstremisme. Gitu. Jadi setelah saya coba baca-baca kembali literatur soal ekstremisme itu, maka kalau kita lihat dari sudut pandang politik ada dua hal. Satu, ekstremisme dianggap sebagai sesuatu yang bersifat politik atau tujuannya politik. Bisa dua-duanya. Yang kedua, apa saja sebab-sebab politik dari terjadinya ekstremisme itu? Kan ada banyak sebab lain selain sebab politik. Nah, ekstremisme yang bersifat politik atau tujuannya politik bisa kita anggap sebagai ekstremisme yang dilakukan untuk merebut atau mempertahankan kekuasaan, baik langsung maupun tidak langsung, bersifat fisik maupun non fisik, dengan kekerasan maupun dengan tanpa kekerasan, ekstrim. Kan ekstrim bisa juga tanpa kekerasan, tapi ekstrim. Saya ambil contoh-contoh ekstrim, tapi di luar Indonesia ini, biar aman. Pertama mungkin yang belajar sejarah Asia Tenggara masih ingat kekerasan ekstrim di Kamboja tahun 1975 sampai 79. Bagaimana ada sekitar 2 juta orang, kalau nggak salah hampir 2 juta orang mati, dibunuh dengan sengaja untuk tujuan yang sifatnya politik, yaitu katanya ideologi politik dari rejim Khmer ketika itu, yang menganggap bahwa orang-orang yang untuk kembali ke kejayaan masa lalu, Kamboja harus membersihkan orang-orang yang saat ini sudah tidak pure lagi, terkualifikasi lagi, karena mereka ingin menjadikan membangun Kamboja mulai dari titik nol, yaitu tahun 75 itu. Ini dinasti otoritarisme dari Pol Pot dan teman-temannya. Juga barangkali kita bisa melihat dari sisi politik kekerasan ekstrim yang dialami oleh etnis Rohingya di Myanmar. Salah satu analis menyatakan misalnya salah satu aspek dari mengapa meningkatnya kekerasan ekstrim terhadap Rohingya itu adalah militer itu mencoba melakukan reformasi, pada saat yang sama militer ingin tetap menunjukkan kepada masyarakat bahwa militer itu tetap relevan untuk menjaga Myanmar. Salah satu caranya adalah dengan menginstigasi langsung atau tidak langsung kekerasan terhadap etnis Rohingya. Itu salah satu analis yang bisa dilakukan. Jadi kekerasan digunakan untuk mencapai tujuan politik. Jadi kekerasan dilakukan atau di-endorse untuk sesuatu yang sifatnya politik. Bisa juga ekstremisme bersifat politik itu dimiliki oleh partai politik ekstrim. Di Indonesia mungkin ada. Tidak ada di Indonesia mungkin partai ekstrim yang anti agama tertentu atau anti etnis tertentu atau anti orang asing. Republikannya sih ada, tapi partai yang seperti itu kayaknya belum ada. Tapi di negara-negara Eropa misalnya ada the radical rights ya, misalnya. Jadi ekstremisme yang bersifat politik bisa seperti itu. Kemudian aktor dari ekstremisme ini bisa negara, bisa juga non-negara. Tadi kalau kita ambil contoh di Myanmar, bisa negara kalau pengertian tentara, tapi juga non-negara karena ada ekstremitas terjadi juga dilakukan oleh kelompok bersenjata yang melakukan pemberontakan terhadap pemerintah pusat misalnya. Nah, ekstremisme yang bersifat politik atau tujuannya politik ini menurut saya bisa disebabkan oleh segala hal yang terkait dengan ekstremisme. Yang mungkin Pak Nanti sudah membahas tadi pagi mungkin karena saya nggak hadir. Jadi segala bentuk ekstremisme seperti push factor dan pull factor bisa saja kita anggap sebagai penyebab dari salah satu atau beberapa di antaranya itu menjadi penyebab dari adanya ekstremisme yang bersifat politik atau tujuannya politik. Kita tahu bahwa sudah banyak di antara ahli sudah menganalisis bahwa faktor-faktor struktural yang bisa mempengaruhi terjadinya ekstremisme itu seperti masalah sosial ekonomi, masalah adanya marginalisasi dan diskriminasi, pemerintahan yang buruk, masalah hukum, konflik dan sebagainya. Juga faktor-faktor yang juga para psikologi sudah sudah analisis atau sudah identifikasi seperti motivasi individu, kekecewaan kolektif akibat penindasan, penyalahgunaan agama, faktor kepemimpinan, faktor ideologi politik, perbedaan budaya dan jaringan sosial. Jadi menurut saya ekstremisme yang bersifat politik atau tujuannya politik dapat disebabkan oleh segala hal yang terkait dengan sebab-sebab dari ekstremisme itu. Masih apa? Ya. Nah, yang kedua ini yang terakhir dari sudut pandang politik, saya kira ekstremisme bisa dilihat sudut pandang politik dalam model ekstremisme adalah dengan mencari akar-akar atau sebab-sebab politik dari terjadinya ekstremisme, baik yang violent maupun yang tidak, baik yang menganjurkan kekerasan maupun yang tidak. Pertama, political root causes itu adalah ideologi politik. Ideologi politik bisa bersifat lokal, nasional maupun internasional. Mungkin kalau yang sudah ada di Indonesia, ideologi politik yang sifatnya internasional adalah CSIS, bisa disebut gitu, Pak Jum? Ya, ideologi politik yang sifatnya transnasional, tapi bisa masuk dalam sudut pandang penyebab dari ekstremisme politik. Bisa juga partai politik transnasional seperti Hizbut Tahrir, misalnya. Nah, ideologi politik yang seperti ini bisa macam-macam, bisa berbentuk separatisme etnis dan atau agama. Di Indonesia tampaknya ini tidak ada ya. Kalau Aceh mungkin sempat dikategorisasi sebagai separatisme etnis, tapi kemudian persoalan sudah selesai. Kemudian ideologi rasisme, ideologi yang sifatnya melakukan ras tertentu dan anti kepada etnis atau agama tertentu. Paling tidak secara formal nggak tahu ada nggak di Indonesia ideologi rasisme seperti ini. Kemudian yang kedua, akar-akar atau sebab-sebab politik dari ekstremisme adalah ini yang dikenal dengan grievance, kekecewaan politik yang sangat mendalam. Di Indonesia masalah Palestina ini terus-menerus bisa dieksploitasi karena saya kira kekecewaan politik sebagian atau banyak dari masyarakat Islam soal tidak selesai-selesainya masalah Palestina itu bisa menjadi salah satu sumber atau isu untuk terjadinya ekstremitas di bidang politik ini. Demikian juga dengan masalah seperti masalah Rohingya. Ini bisa juga menjadi salah satu sumber kekecewaan politik yang mendalam yang bisa memicu adanya ekstremisme. Aspek-aspek yang terkait dengan domestik politik juga mungkin bisa dieksploitasi. Misalnya kalau ada narasi bahwa etnis tertentu di Indonesia itu sudah berkuasa sangat masif secara ekonomi, lalu sekarang mereka mencoba juga berkuasa secara politik, lalu itu bisa dieksploitasi untuk memunculkan adanya narasi bahwa ada kekecewaan politik yang mendalam di dalam masyarakat, sehingga itu bisa menimbulkan juga ekstremitas. Nah, yang ketiga, ini barangkali yang paling sering kita bahas, yaitu politisasi. Ekstremisme terjadi karena dia sebetulnya dieksploitasi karena datangkan keuntungan politik maupun non politik. Saya kira contoh bagus itu adalah studi dari Stephen Wilkinson tahun 2006, bukunya tentang kekerasan Hindu Muslim di India. Stephen Wilkinson, judul bukunya itu adalah Electoral Incentives and Ethnic Violence, kalau kita salah begitu judulnya itu. Dia mengatakan bahwa terjadinya kekerasan antara Hindu dan Muslim di India itu bukanlah karena sebab-sebab yang semata-mata terkait dengan Hindu Muslim itu sendiri, tetapi karena kekerasan itu terjadi akibat dia diinstigasi, didorong, kemudian juga dibiarkan, karena itu akan mendatangkan keuntungan politik bagi aktor-aktor politik yang ada. Baik, terutama adalah ketika kekerasan itu bisa dianggap menimbulkan atau memunculkan insentif untuk keuntungan elektoral. Jadi yang di mana partai, misalnya partai ekstrim Hindu di India melihat bahwa dengan mengeksploitasi isu kekerasan Muslim dan Hindu di daerah tersebut mereka bisa memperoleh keuntungan elektoral, maka kemudian itu akan dibiarkan atau malah diinstigasi. Jadi ini faktor ketiga yang bisa menyebabkan terjadinya ekstremisme dalam dari sudut pandang apa sebab politik atau political causes dari ekstremisme tersebut. Yang keempat adalah krisis politik yang berkepanjangan. Tadi sudah saya singgung sedikit. Krisis politik berkepanjangan baik di tingkat domestik maupun di tingkat internasional bisa memicu terjadinya, bisa menjadi akar politik atau masalah politik terjadinya ekstremisme. Nah, Nah, terakhir radikalisasi politik. Kita mungkin heran di Indonesia, Mas Denny ada ya? Di Indonesia itu beberapa survei menemukan seperti di MRT misalnya, makin terdidik, makin kota, makin ekstrim. Gitu. Ada kita menemukan fenomena itu. Survei juga menemukan, dan itu konsisten temannya, misalnya makin muda, makin terdidik, makin kota, makin cenderung mendukung Prabowo, misalnya di Indonesia. Apa penyebabnya itu? Penjelasannya apa gitu? Apakah orang terdidik, orang kota lebih paham kelemahan Jokowi dan lebih mengerti keunggulan Prabowo atau apa? Ternyata setelah kita cross check ke beberapa variabel, salah satu yang menarik adalah tadi makin terdidik, makin tinggal di kota, makin urban, itu memang unsur ekstremismenya atau berlebaran itu unsur intoleransi dan sebagainya itu terlihat lebih tinggi. Nah, jadi mengapa begitu? Jadi salah satu jawaban adalah ini. Mungkin ini yang menjadi concern dari Mas Saiful Umam dan kawan-kawan ya, soal radikalisasi politik. Nah, kita tahu bahwa radikalisasi politik itu ketika seseorang itu biasa saja, tapi kemudian dia masuk ke sebuah proses di mana dia diberi narasi bahwa saudara-saudara muslimnya sedang terancam, kemudian tanah kita sedang direbut orang dan sebagainya itu, walaupun dia orang yang terdidik, orang kota, bisa saja kemudian mengalami proses radikalisasi. Jadi proses radikalisasi atau aspek radikalisasi politik bisa menjadi salah satu unsur yang menimbulkan terjadinya ekstremisme. Barangkali itu sebagai pembuka dari saya untuk masuk ke materi utama. Dr. Matthew Nanes, sorry to say wrongly your name. Mudah-mudahan ini ada manfaatnya dan untuk teman-teman yang nanti akan melakukan survei lebih lanjut mengenai violent extremism ini. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang.
Terima kasih Bapak Jaya Hanan yang sudah menambahkan wawasan kami semua terhadap politics of extremism. Next, please welcome Mr. Burhanuddin Muhtadi as our moderator for the next session, which is conducting surveys of religious and non-religious extremism. Mr. Muhtadi, you may have the floor.
Thank you. Very good afternoon, everyone. Thanks CSIS and MSI for organizing this seminar. We now arrive in the last session of this conference, and the topic that we would like to discuss is how to conduct surveys on religious and non-religious extremism. And we are fortunate to have a distinguished speaker still here. Dr. Matthew Nanes. How to pronounce it? Yeah. So he received his PhD from University of California, San Diego. He is now assistant professor at Stanley University in the United States. He conducted fieldwork in many hotspots, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, United Emirates Arab. He also did observational surveys and experimental surveys in Iraq and Israel. So a lot of things related with Middle East. So I just want to read his publication. It may be useful for you. Salah satunya dimuat di Cornell University Press, The Extreme of Preference Alignment Israel Religion of Proxy Agent in Lebanon and Gaza in Proxy Wars. Dia juga menulis tentang political violence cycle, reform incentive, and the provision of counter-terrorism. It's already published by Comparative Political Studies of 2017. Matthew juga nulis tentang kegiatan muat di Conflict Management and Peace Science, Hosting Divided Societies, Office Inclusion, Citizen Cooperation, and Crime Prevention. Jadi, maybe we have 1 hour presentation, jadi panjang. Dan teman-teman kalau misalnya mau tanya, kita punya waktu kurang lebih hampir 2 jam, ya, cukup. Jadi ini sesi penutup, jadi tolong kawan-kawan Persepi maupun partner dari Persepi bisa mengelaborasi lebih jauh apa yang akan dijelaskan oleh Matthew. The stage yours.
So, I have good news and I have bad news. The bad news is I have many more than 5 slides. But the good news is I had 3 cups of coffee at lunch, so I'll move quickly. So thank you very much for the warm welcome. Thank you to CSIS for inviting me and putting on this great presentation and this great workshop. I'm very happy to be here. So as you already heard, I'm an assistant professor of political science at St. Louis University. Before that, I was at Stanford for a year and received my PhD from University of California. Most of my work is in the Middle East. I do research primarily on policing and domestic security and how to provide policing services in difficult circumstances. Now, I've also had an opportunity over the last couple of years to take that research to the Philippines. And so as I go through this presentation today on running surveys on extremism and how to measure sensitive topics in general, I'll draw on some examples from my work, both in the Philippines and in Iraq, and happy to talk more about both projects during Q&A. Now, some of what I'll say on the mechanics of doing surveys may be a little bit intuitive, especially for this audience of people who are already interested in surveys. I don't have to convince you all that surveys are a useful tool, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But I do think there's some value to formalizing some of these ideas and tackling them head on rather than relying purely on intuition. So let's say up front that there's no one definition of extremism. We've heard a number of different definitions today. I do think they all seem to be consistent with one another. And I'm going to add a couple more potential definitions on top. So the first is violent extremism, not specifically religious extremism, and this comes from the Asia Foundation. And they say violent extremism describes a wide range of violence, from terror attacks to ethnic riots and sectarian killings, as well as beliefs that are perceived to be conducive to such acts. So notice in particular, the Asia Foundation doesn't define violent extremism only as acting on this impulse to commit violence, but even the beliefs that may be conducive to those actions, they consider to be violent extremism. And so we're going to talk a little bit as the presentation goes on about why surveys are particularly useful for measuring beliefs. Now, talking specifically about religious extremism is the expression of extreme and unjust positions or actions taken by some adherents of a religion based on their understanding of a religious teaching or scripture. And so in this definition, it's not just high-intensity beliefs about religion, but the twisting of religion for purposes that maybe it's not initially intended for. Now, there are a couple of key points that I want to focus on in both of these definitions, and I think some of the definitions that we've heard already today are consistent with this as well. The first is we don't observe extremism directly, or at least we don't always observe it directly, right? We observe the actions that people take due to extremism, but we don't necessarily observe the extremist beliefs in and of themselves. Now, sometimes, but not always, these actions are violent, but they can also take the form of intolerance. But ultimately what makes extremism, or what makes violence extremism, is the belief system that the actions originate from. Right? It's the motives for committing the actions that make them extremism. And I'm going to tell you today, and you may disagree, but this is my argument, that surveys are uniquely situated to measure these beliefs, which is why we should all be thinking about running surveys when we're doing research and conducting policy programs on extremism. Okay, we can only go forwards, not backwards. So to get a sense of how broad extremism can be, and the types of questions we might ask on a survey about extremism, here are a couple of examples. And these come from real surveys. As you know, there are many forms of jihad. Do you believe that violence is an important component of jihad? Okay? And this gets at what Professor Fair was talking about earlier, about how concepts like Sharia or jihad, they can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it's important to take them apart and ask specifically about the components that we're actually interested in. Are you satisfied with the steps taken by public authorities to safeguard the rights of minorities in Bangladesh? Would you object to a member of your family marrying someone of a different faith? And if you knew that the NPA, this is from the Philippines, so the NPA being the New People's Army, if you knew that the NPA were using your neighbor's house to store weapons, would you report it to authorities? So all four of these very different questions come from surveys that are interested in the topic of extremism. They don't necessarily measure extremism themselves, but they are asked by people and by organizations that are interested in extremism. And you can see how different they are and how much variety there is in surveys on this topic. So how should we use surveys? Right? We can use them in a number of different ways. They're a very powerful tool that, in my experience, are underutilized in policy programming. And that's not to say that we don't run enough surveys. If anything, we might run too many surveys. But because we don't use the surveys that we run to their full potential. So here are a few different ways that we might use them in policy programming, particularly on preventing and countering violence. First and foremost, and I think this is the single most common way that we've all seen surveys used, is to evaluate current conditions. So for example, research shows that an important component of state legitimacy and rule of law is people's willingness to resolve disputes through the courts and through government institutions and the criminal justice system. On the other hand, in cases like the Philippines, where you have an ongoing insurgency trying to undermine the legitimacy of the government, the insurgents, in this case the NPA, runs alternative courts and an alternative judicial system in areas where they have a strong presence that compete with the government. And so they try to convince people, if you have a dispute, you have a problem with your neighbor, don't go to the police, don't go to the courts, come to us and we'll help you resolve the dispute. Right? So it's not violent, but it cuts at the very legitimacy of the government. We also see this in Syria with Islamic State, replacing government service-providing institutions, including criminal justice, replacing them with their own institutions. And so when you're talking about evaluating current conditions, you might ask a question like, if you were involved in a dispute with a neighbor, would you turn to the courts to resolve it? It's a fairly innocuous question if you take it out of context, but when you put it in this context of state legitimacy, it actually becomes very powerful. And surveys are well situated to measure how likely people are to do that sort of thing. But we can go deeper, right? And so I'm going to give you some suggestions, some ideas about how else we might use surveys. You can use them to track changing conditions over time. Simply put, you ask the same question today, you ask it again in a year with the same population, you compare the answers, right? It's a very consistent measure because you control exactly what's being asked, and so you can see how these attitudes and behaviors are changing over time. So how does willingness to engage with state institutions change? Very similarly, you use it to compare conditions across locations. How does willingness to engage with state institutions differ between Cebu and Davao. Right? You might have some thoughts about the differences between different places and how it affects something like state legitimacy or the presence of insurgents, and so you can ask the question in both places. Next, you can use surveys to identify risk factors. If we think of willingness to, or avoidance of state institutions as a risk factor for extremism, right? It's an indicator that there are more insurgents present or that they have a stronger support base. Where do people place the lowest legitimacy in government? You can ask questions on a survey to see where people might be more or less at risk. The last two items here are closely related to one another, and they relate to programming. So you can use surveys to design a program, a policy program, right? Where should we target public development programs, counterinsurgency programs, counter-extremism programs? Presumably, if you think that public development programs are a solution to extremism, right? You build roads, you build schools, people become happier with the government, they're less likely to turn to extremists. You'd probably rather spend your money building those schools and building those roads in areas where the population is at risk of being co-opted by extremists. You don't want to waste your money building those roads and building those schools in areas that don't need them. And so you can use a survey to design a program and target it more effectively. You can also use surveys to evaluate the programs that you do run. So let me give you an example of some of my research on my work where my co-authors and I used a survey, or a series of surveys, to evaluate a policy program. So the Philippine National Police wanted to know whether community policing reduces crime. Community policing is this idea originating from primarily North America, but also some areas in Europe. And the idea is when you bring law enforcement closer to the community, you build relationships and trust between ordinary police officers who are going to be out on the street enforcing the law and the people who they are policing. Then people will be more willing to engage with the police in a productive manner, more likely to come to them with problems, more likely to report crimes to them, and this makes the police more effective. So the Philippine National Police, in recognition that they have some problems, said, let's start to try to chip away at these problems and implement community policing. But they want to know if it's working, right? It's a fairly substantial investment. It's a significant departure from the way they've done things in the past. So, they want to know if it works. So they implemented this program in Sorsogon province, which is a province in southern Luzon that they're calling One Sorsogon. And they came to me and some of my colleagues to design the program in a way that could be evaluated effectively. So the program has a number of components. There's an information and signature drive where officers go out into the community, including areas where they wouldn't normally police. They introduce themselves to people. They say, hi, I'm Officer Fernandez. I work in your region. This is what I do. This is where I come from. Here's how you can get in touch with me if you have any help. Now, along with the help of my research team, they implemented an SMS hotline. There's a number that you can send a text message to that will go to the police station, and so you can report information to the police without having to pick up the phone and talk to someone and wait on hold, without having to walk to the police station. And the idea that at least we think is it's a little bit less intimidating to just send a text message. So it lowers the barriers of reporting information to the police. And as part of setting up this hotline, we didn't just create it, we also had to get the word out. So my team and I printed out 150,000 stickers, you can see them in the photo there. And then police officers went around to the different areas and distributed the stickers, stuck them on walls, and so everyone has the phone number. Finally, we created local community policing task forces. So the Philippine National Police is a national institution. They take their orders from Manila. They have police stations in the larger cities, and then they go out into smaller barangays, smaller villages, only when they're actually needed. That's the standard model. And we wanted it to become more community focused. And so we created these task forces where 2 officers were assigned to a specific village And they would work on a task force with local community leaders, with local politicians and elected officials to identify specific problems in that area and design and implement solutions that were appropriate again to that area. So this is making everything very local. So that's the program. That's community policing. And what we wanted to do was figure out whether it was working. So the first thing we did was convince the police to implement it only in a random subset of barangays, random subset villages. Right? So you would have control villages that did not get the program. You would have treatment villages that did get the program. And because the treatment was randomly assigned, the control villages were the same as the treatment villages, right? The only difference between them was that they were going to get this community policing program. So did it work, right? Did it actually reduce crime, which ultimately is what we care about? Well, you would think, why do you need a survey here? You can just compare crime rates in control villages with crime rates in the treatment villages. And if your program is working, then you'll have less crime in areas that got community policing. But the problem, of course, is that people won't report crimes to the police if they don't trust them. And so, if community policing is increasing trust in the police, then it's also increasing the proportion of crimes that are getting reported to the police. Which means if you look at the official crime statistics, it looks like crime is going up. And so you don't know whether your program has failed spectacularly and you've actually made crime worse, or if crime has gone down, but reporting of crime has gone up, and it just looks like crime is going up because you're seeing more of it reported. So the solution, of course, is to use a survey. So what we did is we surveyed all of the barangays, control and treatment, both before and after the program. And we asked people, right? We sent enumerators, not police officers, we sent civilians knocking on doors, and asked them, could you please tell me whether you personally have been the victim of a crime? We asked about specific types of crime in the last 6 months. And so what we're looking for is whether the crime rates increased or decreased in the treatment versus the control areas. And if the program worked, we should see a decrease in crime from before the program to after the program, only in the areas where you implemented the program. Now, I was hoping to show you the results from this project today. They are currently embargoed by the funder, so it is unfortunately too soon to say whether it worked. But what I can say with some confidence is if it worked, we will know. Right? And so what I want to hammer on is we could not accurately assess this community policing program without using surveys, right? Any other source of data on crime is going to be hopelessly correlated with people's trust in the police, which is exactly what community policing is changing. And so the only way to get a good handle on whether this program is working is to use survey. The other point I want to make sure we get from this is that folding the surveys into the very design of the program makes it a lot easier to evaluate whether or not the program worked. Now, we could have come in after the fact, right? So the police could have run community policing without us having any involvement in the design, and then come to us and say, hey, we want to know whether this worked. And we could have run a survey and gotten some results and looked at places that got it, places that didn't get it, and it would have been fine, but it would not have been as accurate a measure of the effectiveness of community policing as it is by designing the survey as part of the program. So for those of you who do policy program, I do want to emphasize, think about your evaluations from day one, or even from day zero. When you're designing the program, think about how you'll evaluate them and include your surveys as part of the design of the program. Okay, so none of that had anything to do with extremism, right? In my case, we wanted to know about crime. We think crime was not particularly sensitive, and so we simply asked a direct question, did you experience a crime? And we expect that if they did, they'll tell our enumerators the truth. We're going to set that aside for a moment and spend the rest of the time talking about issues where maybe people won't tell the truth. Okay? Now, I do want to just run through this checklist of what to do before you start a survey. It seems silly, but decide what information you want to measure. I see so many surveys, both in academia and in the policy world, where people first say, oh, hey, let's run a survey. Everyone's running surveys. It seems like a good way to get information. Let's run a survey too. Let's get some money to get there and do it. Okay, what are we going to measure? That's backwards. A survey may be the right tool, but it may not be the right tool. Start with knowing what you want to measure, and then ask yourself if the survey is the right tool. Second, what's the scope of the information that you're interested in? And this varies on a couple of dimensions. First, in terms of time, do you want to know about conditions on the ground today? Do you want to do a retrospective study of what happened 10 years ago? That's going to affect who you ask and how you ask it. What area are you interested in? And who are you interested in? And all of that leads into how are you going to reach the people that you actually want to know information about. So in the Philippines, we sent our enumerators door to door. It's not that difficult of an area. Sort of quirk of the particular insurgency that the Philippines are dealing with is they attack government forces, they tend not to attack civilians, and so we were actually able to back channel with the NPA and make sure they didn't have a problem with our enumerators doing the survey in the area, and they said, as long as you stay away from certain topics, you're free to do your research. And so we were able to send our enumerators into these areas. That's not always possible, right? There are places in the world where if we had sent enumerators in asking questions about contacting the police, they would have been kidnapped and held for ransom or worse. And so sometimes it's better or safer to use a phone interview, if you have phone numbers, or an internet interview, if your respondents have reliable internet connections. Now, of course, there are pluses and minuses to this, right? Not having enumerators present improves privacy and security, but very much limits the people you can reach. And also, people have short attention spans, right? It's already a stretch to get someone to spend 45 minutes getting your survey when you're standing right in front of them, interacting with them. If I'm sitting at my computer clicking through screens by myself, I'm going to start to lose focus after like 15 minutes. Okay, so you want to be conscious of that as well. Mail is also possible, but that means you're losing control of your data for some period of time, right? If you put your survey in an envelope and put it in the mailbox, you don't know what happens to it before it hopefully comes out the other side. Maybe it doesn't come out the other side. And so you have to be a little bit careful about that method as well. Finally, you can do what's called an intercept interview. And the Asia Foundation does this with their survey in Afghanistan. They regularly are interested in the attitudes and opinions of people who live in areas that they simply can't send enumerators to. It's just too dangerous. And so they do what they call intercept interviews. They send their enumerators to highway junctions and bus stops where people regularly travel from the dangerous area to a safer area, usually for work or to go shopping, and they survey it there. Now, of course, again, this isn't perfect because then you're only getting access to a subset of people who travel, people who work, but it's better than not having any information about the area at all. So this brings us to the last two questions that you have to ask before starting a survey. Will people participate, and will they tell you the truth? So in evaluating community policing, we didn't have a problem convincing people to participate, and we're pretty sure we didn't have a problem getting them to tell the truth. Right? It's fairly innocuous when there's a civilian from a respected polling agency standing at your door saying, hey, this is an academic survey, we're evaluating community policing, can you tell me if you experienced a theft in the last 6 months? People are probably going to tell you the truth. If you want to know whether they would report insurgent activity to the police, they're not going to answer that question. And they might get very upset at you for asking. So the rest of my talk is going to be about how to solve that issue. There are essentially two types of non-response or refusal to, two types of non-response to be aware of. And it's worth separating these out conceptually. People might simply refuse to participate in the survey. You knock on my door, you say, hi, I'm Matthew Names, I'm from St. Louis University, I'm conducting research on extremism, and I'm doing a survey. Will you take my survey? And they say, no, I don't want to take your survey, and they close the door in your face. The second type of non-response is they say, yes, okay, I'm willing to take your survey. And I'm asking my questions, and we're going down the list. And then we get to the questions that I actually care about, and I say, if you knew there were insurgents in your neighborhood, would you call the police? And they say, no, I'm not going to answer that question. We call that item non-response. And from a mathematical perspective, these are very similar challenges. They do similar things to your data. And so we're going to solve them somewhat similarly. But when you're thinking about how to report your data and how to report your information, it is useful to report separately, right? So I want to know how many people did you select in your sample who refused to participate? And then I also want to know for each individual question that you asked, how many people say, I'm not answering that question, okay? Now, there are two reasons, or two categories of reasons why people might refuse to answer questions on sensitive topics, or might answer untruthfully, which I'm going to lump in for now, okay? Sometimes people just don't want you to have the information. If I support the Taliban, and you're trying to find out which areas the Taliban operate in as part of the counterinsurgency program, I don't want you to know whether or not they're in my area. Because if you know, you're going to attack them. And so short of me lying about what my survey is about or what information I'm collecting, I'm never going to get you to give me the information. And so when that's the case, the survey probably just isn't the right tool. There's not much you can do with that. But luckily, there's another reason why people might refuse to answer that I think is actually more common, and it's something we can address. And the idea is that sometimes people don't mind you having information, in principle, but they don't want their identity linked with it. Maybe because they're afraid of retaliation, or maybe because it's embarrassing, right? So if we want, for example, we want to know how often people go to mosque. There's no reason why someone should mind me having information about how often people go to mosque, but you're not going to admit, well, I go once every 4 months, right? That's kind of embarrassing. You don't want to be the one to say that, right? And so the second category of challenges, where people are willing to give you information, but don't want their identity linked to that information, that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of today. Before we get into solutions, I want to emphasize just how problematic non-response can be. So, the problem is that the people who refuse to answer are almost always different than the people who agree to answer, right? You refuse to answer for a reason. Maybe the people who go to the mosque every week are happy to answer your question. And the people who don't answer your question are the people who never go. And so then your results make it look like people always go to the mosque, and that's simply not reality, right? So excuse your results. So here's an example from an Asia Foundation survey where they're interested in sympathy with armed militants. They want to know what percentage of people sympathize with these armed groups. And this is actually a very good question. They did well. They found that 16% of respondents sympathize with armed militants, and they had a 6% non-response rate. A 6% non-response rate on any survey like this is excellent. So again, I want to emphasize, this is done correctly. This is what they have. But the problem is, if they found 16% of respondents sympathize, and they got 6% non-response, it could actually mean that anywhere between 10 and 22% sympathize, right? Because if all the people who refuse to answer do sympathize with armed groups, you just added like more than a quarter to your positive results there. Alternatively, you could have a substantially lower result than you think you do, and you just don't know. And this wouldn't be such a problem if we thought that there was no bias, right? If we thought that the people who refused to answer were more or less the same, it would be less of a problem. We have tools for dealing with that. But we know that that's probably not true. Now think if the survey wasn't done as well, and instead of 6% non-response, they had 15% non-response, or 20% non-response. Well, now that range of where your true answer could lie goes all the way below 0, and you really just have no idea what you found. measuring rare events, things that don't occur very often. And if you have a 6% non-response rate, and you measure a 2% prevalence of something, it goes below zero. You just have no idea, right? And so this is particularly problematic in surveys about extremism, where we're measuring infrequent outcomes. So there are a few best practices to always keep in mind when running surveys on sensitive topics. You want to use experienced, trustworthy enumerators. We heard a little bit about this morning. This is not time to cut costs by hiring local high school students to run your survey. Local enumerators have a better sense of security, which streets are safe and which ones aren't, and when something just doesn't feel right. You, of course, always want to conduct a survey in native language of both the respondent and the enumerator. You don't want a bunch of foreigners coming in to run your survey. You want people who can be understood perfectly without any ambiguity by your respondents. And gender can be really critical. And the way in which it matters depends on the context. There are a lot of places where women won't talk to strange men. And so having only male enumerators means you're not going to get a lot of women willing to take your survey. It's always best to do the survey in a private location. Now, that might mean in the respondent's home, right? So there aren't onlookers. But it might not be the respondent's home, particularly in situations where spouses or husbands insist on sitting and listening in on the survey and maybe guiding the response of their spouse. You might be in a more private location if you leave the respondent's home and go somewhere else. You can't always eliminate onlookers, right? Particularly if you're surveying in a cafe or in a public location, there's sometimes just nothing you can do about people being nosy. But if you can't get rid of them, you should at least have your enumerators record on the survey whether or not there are people listening. And then we can do things in the analysis after the fact to account for that. And finally, take advantage of technology that's available to you. So in the Philippines, one of the things that we're really worried about is we send our enumerators out into these remote villages to do surveys on tablets, and we worry that the tablets might get stolen, or that someone might stop the enumerator, either a police officer or a criminal, an insurgent, who knows, and say, hey, show me what's on that tablet. So the software that we use allows them to lock the data. So when the enumerator finishes the survey, they advance to the final screen, they hit complete. And once they hit complete, you can no longer view the data on that tablet. Right? The only way to get the answers that people have provided is for me to go to a computer and log in with a password and download all the data from all the tablets. So once the survey is completed, the enumerator is on the bus coming back to the office, and the police officer says, hey, what were you doing back there? Show me that tablet. They can show them the tablet, they'll see the surveys, they'll see the questions, but they won't be able to see anyone's answers. As I mentioned earlier, you can use technology to remove enumerators from the setting entirely by doing internet or phone enumeration. It reduces exposure, but of course it comes with its own set of limitations. Before we get to more complicated techniques for improving response rates, sometimes the simple answer is best, or the simple strategy is the best. So think about how to change the way you word the question in order to make people more comfortable. In particular, think about moderating or depersonalizing your questions. So if the original question that you want to ask is, do you believe that heretics should be killed? You can see why that may upset people. They might not want to answer. The moderated version would be, do you ever believe that do you believe that it's ever justified to use violence against those who insult God? Same concept, a slightly softer way of asking it. And the depersonalized version would be, would you say that people in your village generally think that heretics should be killed? So, in other words, rather than asking what I personally believe, ask, how prevalent do you think this attitude is in the area where you live? And generally speaking, people are more willing to answer these depersonalized questions. Now, sometimes the simple version just isn't good enough and you have to do something a little bit more complex. So here's some examples from two of my own research projects that use surveys to measure extremism, where we had to take a little bit more, a more extreme method for measuring extremism. So the first, again in the Philippines, again in Sorsogon province. Now, Sorsogon has historically been a stronghold for the New People's Army, the NPA, a communist militant group that wants to overthrow the Filipino government. My co-authors and I wanted to know how civilian-provided information affects the police's battle against the NPA, right? And in particular, we want to know whether people in different areas would report NPA activities to the police if they knew about them. You can imagine there are a couple of problems with asking this question. If people said they would report the NPA, they might be afraid of retaliation. And if they said they would report the NPA, they might be afraid of getting arrested or harassed by the police. Now, the strategy that we took here was to let respondents self-enumerate. Right? The idea is they don't mind us having the information, but they're afraid of having their personal identity linked with the information. We don't ask their names or anything on the survey, so there's no way to identify them in the data. The only way to link their identity with the data is because there's an enumerator standing right in front of them looking at them in the face when they ask a question. And so the goal here was to remove the enumerator from the equation and prevent the enumerator from knowing how an individual answers. So the enumerator reads the question out loud and then hands the tablet to the respondent. The enumerator had to read the question out loud because many of our respondents can't read. So they read it, they say, if you knew about the activities of our group, would you report them to the authorities? They hand the tablet to the respondent, and then they explain the answer choices. Right, and again, you can see we use symbols because not all of them are literate. And then the respondent holds the tablet, chooses the answer without the enumerator being able to see, advances the screen, and then hands the tablet back to the enumerator. So the key details here, in order to make this work, maybe. There we go. So, things to watch out for when you're using self-enumeration. The respondent has to be comfortable using the tablet. We had a number, particularly of older respondents, who had never used a tablet before and just didn't know what to do with it. They didn't want to hold it, they didn't want to touch it. You can imagine if you've never seen a touch screen before, it would probably freak you out to be handed one and told to use it right then and there. You're limited to simple answer choices, particularly with illiterate respondents who can't go reading long paragraphs of answers. So in our case, we're kind of limited to yes, no, don't know, prefer not to answer. And then you want to make sure that there's no way for the enumerator to go back and look at the answer after they get the tablet back. And the respondent has to understand this, right? The respondent has to believe that this method actually protects their privacy, right? If they don't believe that it protects their privacy, it's not going to do any good. So again, I was hoping to show you the actual results on willingness to report insurgents. The results are still embargoed, but what I can show you is results from a pilot survey where we're trying to figure out if this method of self-enumeration was even going to work. And so we asked a number of questions, including, so we sent enumerators around doing this method, and then we followed up with respondents right afterwards. And we asked them, did holding the tablet or responding make you confused? And virtually everyone said no, it did not make them confused. And are you willing to answer questions more truthfully when you hold the tablet and only you see the answer? Again, people who didn't trust the tablet, right? You could, tablets have cameras, they have microphones, you might think you're being recorded. A good number of people, 18%, said it made no difference. But a large majority of people said they're more willing to answer sensitive questions when they were the ones inputting the answer. So we were very encouraged by that. And I am looking forward to getting this data in literally any day now. And that'll be interesting to see whether it actually worked. The second project that I want to tell you about comes from Baghdad, Iraq. And it comes in the context of the civil war that started in 2004 that is fought between dozens of different groups as well as the government forces. It's claimed more than 250,000 deaths, and a lot of the violence occurred along sectarian lines, particularly between the Sunni Muslim minority and the Shia Muslim majority. So before 2003, the government was controlled by the Sunni minority. There was an invasion, Saddam Hussein's regime was overthrown, and a democratic system was implemented, which of course meant that with everything already being divided along sectarian lines, the Shia majority took over control of the government. In the wake of that sudden change in political power, there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear over what would happen next. We began to see a lot of Sunni militant groups attacking the Shia-dominated police and security forces. So in this context, I wanted to know what factors made Sunni civilians more or less likely to consider using violence against the government. The problem, of course, is that using violence is illegal, so people would not want to admit it on the survey. I obviously couldn't send my enumerators wandering around Baghdad, knocking on doors and saying, hi, would you like to use violence against the government, right? Nobody was going to answer. My enumerators would get kidnapped or arrested, and I would probably lose my job, which is the least that should happen to me if I did something like that. So, to give you a little more context, these are the neighborhoods of Baghdad. I randomly sampled 22 of the neighborhoods to conduct the survey, and those are the ones that are lit up in green. And I surveyed a total of 800 civilians. Within each neighborhood, I randomly selected streets proportionally to population density, and I sent my enumerators, who were local Iraqis, because of course that's who should be doing the survey, sent these local enumerators who were very experienced and had run many surveys in Baghdad before, to the selected households to do the interviews. Now, because I couldn't ask the question about willingness to use violence directly, I used what's called a list experiment, or you might hear it called an item count. And the list experiment is a measurement device for estimating responses of the sample overall, while keeping individual responses totally private. So here's how it works. I took each respondent and I randomly assigned them to either a short group or a long group. And then the enumerator read out the question. And I should say, the assignment to the short or the long group was all in the background. The respondent didn't see any of this. They didn't know that they were getting a slightly different version of the question. Okay? So they're assigned to either a short group or a long group, and then the enumerator reads the question. And the question is, I'm going to read you a list of 4 if you're in the short group, or 5 if you're in the long group, strategies that citizens sometimes use when the government does not seem to be listening to them. Please tell me how many of these strategies you consider using if you felt the government was ignoring your needs. Remember, I don't need to know which ones you would use, only how many of the 4 or 5 you would consider. The short group got 4 non-controversial items, like voting against the government, or writing letters to the government, things that people should generally be willing to admit to. The long group got the same 4 non-controversial items, as well as a 5th option of using non-peaceful methods, using violence. Right? Now, because people were randomly assigned, to either the short list or the long list. The people on average in each group should be the same, and they should answer the same. And the only difference should be the presence of this fifth option of using violence. So what that means is I can compare the average answers across the short group and the long group to find out how many people would have said yes to this fifth option. So what I found was in the short list group, this is the group where they only got 4 non-controversial items, the average number of things that they said they would have done is about 2.005. In the long group, where they had the option, this fifth option using violence, the average was 2.365. So if I subtract 2.365 from 2.005, I get 0.36. That means that 36% of people in my sample would consider using violence. Okay? Now again, because I didn't ask them which ones they would use, neither I, nor the enumerator, nor anyone who overheard this, nor anyone who stole the data, nobody can ever find out whether any individual person would use violence. All we know is they would consider doing 3 of these things, or 4 of these things, or 2 of these things. But when you take the average answer of the people who had the option of violence, and subtract from it the average answer of the people who didn't have the option of using violence, the only thing that's left over is using violence. So there's some limitations of this list experiment strategy, and they're rather severe, in fact. The first is they can't measure information respondents don't want to reveal. And I want to emphasize, this doesn't solve that first problem of non-response that I brought up. You can only use this to measure things that people are willing to let you know. Okay? It's not a panacea for everything. The second, as you can probably guess, it's really complicated for enumerators. And also, as I'll say in a minute, really confusing for respondents. It's expensive and it's time consuming, right? Surveys cost money. The longer your survey is, the more money it costs. You saw how long it took you to read that question to you. You're giving up a lot of other questions on your survey in order to use a list experiment. It's confusing for your respondents, and that's especially important because it only works if they understand what's going on. It only works if they understand that it protects their privacy. It won't work if they think you're trying to trick them. So I was trying to explain to my grandmother, who is 93 years old, what it is that I do for a living, and why I was running a survey in Iraq and what I was trying to measure, right? And so I'm explaining to her that I want to know about people using violence, and I'm going to use this thing called a list experiment. And here's what I did. And I finished explaining it to her, and she looks at me and she says, oh, I get it, I see. I understand what you're trying to do, and I wouldn't answer. I said, well, why wouldn't you answer to understand? Well, you're trying to trick me into giving you information. That's an example of a list experiment gone horribly wrong. If they think you're trying to trick them, it doesn't work, right? Now, it isn't tricking them. It's not trying to identify them or get them to tell you something they don't want you to don't want to tell you. But if they think that that's what's happening, then they won't answer. And the whole thing is blown, okay? And that actually turns out to be a really common problem with list experiments. People always think you're doing something complicated, you're trying to trick me. And if that happens, you can't trust the data. And finally, these only provide an estimate, right? The random assignment to the short group or the long group creates uncertainty. And you're giving up what we call precision when you do this. And so you need a larger sample, which is more expensive, it's harder to get, right? And so you do have to be conscious with the list experiment and related techniques. You're not getting exact numbers, you're only getting estimates. And so I didn't really find that 36% of Iraqis who use violence. I found 36% with some degree of uncertainty who use violence. It could be 30%, it could be 42%, I don't really know. Now, a list experiment is one of several different types of what I call randomization techniques. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on these, but just to give you an idea of what else is out there, there's something called a forced choice, where you instruct a respondent to first flip a coin. If it lands on heads, they answer yes, no matter what. And if it lands on tails, they tell you the true answer. And so what that means is, if I ask, would you use violence against the government, and they say yes, I don't know if they're saying yes because they really would, or because the coin landed on heads. And so they might be more comfortable answering truthfully that way. Again, it's complicated. They don't necessarily understand what's going on. They might think you're trying to trick them. The math works, I promise the math works, but when it comes to actually going out and implementing these things, you run into all sorts of issues. The last one is endorsement experiment, which we heard a little bit about this morning. These work by as Professor Fair was saying this morning, you randomly assign respondents to one of several different versions of a question that asks about support for an innocuous policy. And then you vary who's endorsing the policy. So if I want to measure support for the Taliban relative to support for the Pakistani government, and I don't think that people are going to necessarily admit to supporting the Taliban, I'm instead going to say, there's this plan to build a bunch of schools in your area. Do you support this plan? In some of those questions, I'm going to say, the Pakistani government promotes this plan. Do you support it? And some of them I'm going to say, the Taliban supports it. Do you promote it? And then I can see whether rates of approval for building schools changes depending on who's endorsing the plan. When thinking about threats to security surrounding survey research, I find it useful to divide the risks into 3 different categories, because which type of risk you're facing can help guide the solution to issues. So it may be the presence in the survey area that's dangerous, right? It could be an active war zone, there could be lots of random violence, and even if your enumerators and your respondents aren't being targeted, just being there could be risky. And when that's the case, again, a survey just might not be the right tool, right? You might try to do a phone survey or an internet survey, but you don't want to put your enumerators in risky situations, and you might just use something other than a survey. The next possibility is that the topics on the survey could upset armed groups, in which case you have to worry about bias from people who are worried about retaliation from that side. And it could also be the topics on the survey are illegal. And in that case, not only do you have to worry about whether people are willing to admit to certain illegal behavior, but then you really have to worry about protecting your data, because you don't want them to get arrested after they put their trust in you and gave you confidential information on the survey, and then the government compels you to hand over your data, right? So you have to be conscious of that as well. The solutions here map on pretty closely to some of the best practices that we talked about earlier. Things like avoiding observers, ensuring that your responses remain anonymous, using tablets to secure your data, avoiding direct individual level questions on sensitive topics, right? It might be illegal to blow up a police station, but it's not illegal for someone to say, I think there are a lot of people in my village who would like to blow up a police station. And always ensure that respondents understand their legal rights to privacy and the limitations of those rights. Don't promise that you will never ever give your data to the police if you can't keep that promise, right? You want to be realistic and honest with them. And if there's a chance that you could be legally compelled to hand over your data, you have to tell them that. So this leads into the topic of informed consent. So this is a standard in academic research that isn't perfect. In fact, often it's quite problematic for this type of survey research because the concept of informed consent comes from a completely different type of research. But still, it's a nice starting point to talk about. So enumerators or surveyors should always start by explaining the purpose of the survey and the procedures, the potential risks, any potential benefits, compensation, and how the survey is going to happen, right? Means of contact being who do you talk to if you have a problem afterwards, right? You take the survey, and then you have some questions about it. Who do you call? How do you call them, right? So all of this information should be provided to your respondents up front. And I want to emphasize that potential benefits are different from compensation. Compensation is, am I going to get paid for taking this survey? Potential benefits are, what are you going to do with this information that's going to help me in my community? This is required for all academic research. I would say it should be strongly recommended for all of us. Even if nobody's making us give informed consent, we should think about doing it, right? We're taking the time of our subjects, we're asking them to put their trust in us. The least we can do is explain what actually is happening with them. A couple actually. Good, thanks. So one of the standards that I always consider at the very beginning of any research project, before I even think about running a survey, that I encourage everyone to think about, is whether the benefit of the survey warrants the risk. There are all sorts of risks involved in sending enumerators out into the field, collecting data from people, asking people sensitive questions. But even if your survey isn't sensitive, you're sending people out into the world to do something for you, and that always poses risks, right? You could be sending them into an area with lots of crime. You could be sending them on roads that have lots of traffic accidents and lots of injuries, right? And you want to ask yourself whether these risks are worth the potential benefits, the things that you're going to learn from the survey. And only you as the researcher can answer that, right? Nobody can answer that for you. But it's really an important question. Okay, 2 more topics. Surveys are a very powerful, very valuable tool, but we can't learn everything about the world just using surveys. And I would argue they're most valuable when combined with other sources of information. You can combine them with interviews and focus groups, right? These are good for identifying more detail and getting into a topic in greater depth. You can use focus groups and interviews to inform and create your survey questions, and also to clarify your responses, right? You can use a survey to find what proportion of people believe something, and then you might be left scratching your head saying, well, why is that? Why do they think that? You can do interviews to follow up and find out. You can combine your surveys with administrative data, right? Compare perceptions against reality. One of the things that I'm really interested in my research is religious integration of the police in places like Iraq, where you have conflict between Sunnis and Shias. How does integrating more Sunnis into the police affect people's attitudes and behaviors? Well, first of all, do people even correctly perceive how many Sunnis there are in the police? So I can ask them how integrated they think the police are, but then I have to combine that with actual data on police officer demographics to find out if they know the truth. And finally, you can look at expert evaluations to validate the responses, right? If you want to know about corruption, you can go to experts in that topic and see if the survey responses that you got match reality. Okay, the last topic is about sharing your results. Surveys are very expensive, and you should share your results with other NGOs, government agencies, researchers. All these other groups can benefit from the data that you paid to collect. I gather that everyone in this room is somewhat like-minded. We're all working towards similar goals, and we should be sharing our data with each other. And that doesn't just mean sharing your findings or your conclusions, but it means sharing your raw data, right? Ideally, at the individual respondent level. So that spreadsheet that comes out of your survey software, take it, clean it up, put it online. You should also share your procedures in detail so that other people who use your data know where it came from and understand the limitations of that data and don't do things with it that they shouldn't be doing. Now, when you do share your data, don't forget to anonymize it. Always remove addresses and phone numbers and names and things like that. I can't tell you how many academic surveys I've downloaded from other people's websites, from online data sources, where they have like the phone number of each respondent. respondents filled in the publicly available spreadsheet. I guarantee you these respondents did not consent to putting their phone numbers online next to their answers, right? That's really bad. Don't do that. But also consider how demographic variables, when combined with one another, and combined with the scope of the survey, could be used to identify your respondents. If you run a survey in a village of 100 people, and you record data on the respondent's age, their gender, what school they went to, their occupation, how many relatives they have. At some point, you combine all those variables, and there's only one person in the village who matches those characteristics. And at that point, anonymity is broken, right? So you have to think a little bit deeply about how to remove those items as well. And finally, beware community-level impacts, particularly on topics like extremism and very sensitive items. Even reporting community-level estimates can lead to backlash. If you report that a particular village in rural Philippines, only 8% of people support the NPA is going to be a little bit unhappy. And you could end up harming the whole village by putting things like that publicly available. So share your results, but be careful in the way you do it. Just to wrap up, sort of main takeaways, surveys can be really useful for identifying, preventing, and countering violent extremism. They collect really detailed individual level data, and this is nice because it's really good for measuring attitudes and beliefs. This root is base of extremism. They're also nice because they can be repeated in multiple areas or over time, so you get consistent measures to track change. And if you implement the survey, you know your data, and therefore you can trust it. But the main challenge when doing a survey on something like extremism is how to ensure privacy and also to convince your respondents that you're maintaining their privacy. Because ultimately, people are only willing to give you accurate, truthful information if they believe that it will be safeguarded. So thanks very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for your interesting presentation. Now we have Q&A. Jadi kalau ada yang mau nanya topik yang berat ini di jam yang ini. Okay, Catherine, please. You can just start.
So, some years ago, a colleague of mine, we decided that we were going to have fun with the people that chose not to answer the question. And so we did a don't know analysis, because what we found, and I'm sure everyone finds this, is that who chooses to not answer the question is not randomly distributed within that question, right? And it's not randomly distributed across all of the questions. So for example, and I forget, I'm giving you examples that are not accurate, so I don't remember the study well enough at this point. We did it a long time ago. But this was some work that we were doing on Iran. And we found that, for example, the people that didn't want to answer questions about democracy were very different based upon their gender and their age. So we actually, it was a really interesting exercise to actually try to extract information based upon people who didn't want to give information.
You can just respond.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And one of the things that I often encourage organizations, agencies, other researchers who are thinking about running a survey, one of the things that I encourage them to do is, first of all, separate out I don't know from prefer not to answer, because those are two very different things. And then also to maintain good records of who says I don't know and who says I prefer not to answer. Because as you point out, you can find out interesting things about who prefers not to answer. Not just demographics, of course, but also thinking about the next survey, right? Thinking about if all the people who preferred not to answer were less educated, maybe that tells us something about the way we're asking the question, and maybe we could have asked it better to get a better response next time.
Siapa lagi mau tanya? Oh, silakan, Apri.
Okay, thanks Matt for this very long presentation, I think. One of the solutions that you give to enable responding to the true answer, for example, using indirect question, right? It's like you use the proxy for addressing your main question, right? So because I think by using indirect questions, it's like, I'm just afraid that it will lead to measurement error in our analysis, right? And if this measurement error happens to be a dependent variable, it will vice versa error, right? And if this happens to be our predictor, it will bias our coefficient. So how would you balance this? On the one hand, by addressing the direct questions, for example, using direct questions, it will lead to invalid answer or negative because our respondent hide the true answer, for example. But if you use indirect questions, then it will lead to invalid answer or imprecision, for example. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a big problem. You can only draw conclusions based on the data that you have and the questions that you actually ask. And so if I ask, do you think people in your village support the NPA? I can't then say, I found this percentage of respondents support the NPA, because that's not what I asked, right? And so it's always a trade-off between asking the question directly and risking getting lied to, and asking indirectly and not quite measuring the thing that you really want to know. Now, I prefer to know what I know and to know what I don't know, rather than not being sure who's lying and how they're lying and how many people are lying. And so to me, it's better to measure something that's not quite what I wanted to measure, but be confident in the data that I gathered, than to ask the question that I'm actually interested in and have no idea how accurate my results are. But you're absolutely right. It's always a trade-off. And it's ultimately going to be answered by you as the researcher deciding what's most important to me, where am I willing to make compromises, and where am I not willing to make compromises.
Thank you. Siapa yang lain? We still have plenty of time for Q&A. Silakan. Ya, silakan.
I guess your experience is mainly in dangerous war zone places. The Philippines might be different, but it's still, I would have to say, in the one that you did is a little bit, probably a bit less stable than what we have here in Indonesia. What do you think of how the approach should be in asking these questions? Religious and non-religious extremism, but on a more stable occasion. Do you think it would be different the way you approach the respondents? Do you think it would be different in even developing the set of questions? Do you think it would be different in your methodology? Even picking out the sample of people? I just want to know, because I think it's the context is slightly different from what your experience, your research experience is slightly different from not only geographically, but condition-wise, culturally, and a lot of different things that might be inapplicable to your situation.
Yeah, so context is critical, and people's willingness to answer certain types of questions varies dramatically from place to place. And I'm always amazed when I run a survey in the Philippines, in particular, how excited people are to talk and to share information. And actually, we have a big problem in our surveys in the Philippines that they end up taking much longer than they should, because the enumerators go to people's houses and start asking people questions, and they think, oh, here's someone who wants to listen to me. I have a lot to say. And they start telling them stories and saying, no, you're asking me the wrong question. Here's what I actually want to tell you. Right? It ends up taking an hour and a half to run a 30-minute survey. Specifically with regard to concern about violence affecting willingness to provide answers, I think it matters and it doesn't. I mean, there's always the embarrassment factor, and I'll go back to my example about willingness to say how often you go to the mosque. There's no, I mean, in Indonesia, in anywhere in the Philippines, even in Iraq, nobody is going to attack you because you answered on a survey that you don't go to the mosque very often. But people still don't tell the truth. Maybe an even better example of this is in the United States. Nobody will answer a survey question about how much money they make. Why? Because, I don't know, because we think it's rude, we think it's embarrassing. For whatever reason, we've developed this social norm that you don't tell people how much money you make. And so it has nothing to do with worry about violence, worry about insurgency, worry about extremism, anything like that. It's just social desirability. Now, I don't have an answer on the percentage of people who don't answer because of social desirability and the percentage of people who are worried about actual physical harm. But my suspicion is it's more about embarrassment and that sort of thing. And ultimately, even if you're not worried about physical harm, right, or even if physical harm does reduce some willingness to answer, there are enough people who wouldn't answer anyway that your survey's in trouble, right? Even if you eliminate all the people who won't tell you about reporting insurgents to the police because they're worried about insurgents coming after them, you're still going to have enough people that won't answer that you should be thinking about how to resolve that issue in your surveys.
Ini topik yang sangat krusial karena teman-teman persepsi di Indonesia umumnya jarang memakai eksperimen. Jadi umumnya memakai direct question. Kita punya pengalaman memakai teknik eksperimen karena teknik ini memberi informasi dan bisa memisahkan antara cause and effect. Jadi mana sebab, mana akibat lebih jelas. Sesuatu yang kadang-kadang kalau kita pakai regresi biasa kita nggak bisa membedakan soal causality. Nah waktu itu kami mengukur efek Jokowi. Gitu ya. Apakah orang memilih PDIP karena Jokowi atau sebaliknya? Nah dengan memakai teknik eksperimen seperti yang tadi dijelaskan sama Matthew, jadi kita randomize responden dalam beberapa kelompok, ada kontrol, ada treatment, itu kita bisa memisahkan secara clear kan efek Jokowi terhadap pilihan partai berapa besar. Nah masalahnya pada titik itu kita bisa dapat estimasi berapa kira-kira efek Jokowi di jelang 2014 dan efek itu ngumpul di PDIP. Nah, di kasus lain itu kami nggak bisa, bukan nggak bisa, eksperimen yang kita pakai ternyata tidak berbeda jauh estimasinya dengan direct question. So, in my study, Matthew, I tried to use experiment for measuring the prevalence of vote buying by using observational study, direct and exclusive question on vote buying, and second one by randomizing my survey participants into 4 groups, one control group, and asking the respondent with uncontrolled visual item, and the rest of the participants were presented the question which controversial items, including vote buying. And I compared the result from the direct and experimental estimate. And surprisingly, those who acknowledge perceived vote buying by using direct question is about 25%. And then using experiment, I got the numbers around 27.4%. So the difference is not too much, you know. And another case, just recently we conducted survey on anti-corruption with MSI USID. We also used direct and experimental question. And again, the estimate collected from direct question do not differ much from the list experiment that we launched. So I don't know whether Indonesian people are honest because the conclusion is also held by George from Texas University. He also used experiment and direct question in Tegal, Kabupaten Tegal, for measuring vote buying, and he also concluded that Indonesians basically more understand people who live in Honduras or Nicaragua when the experiment and the obtrusive and direct question end up with very different estimates. Would you like to comment on that? Oh, okay.
So I should preface this by saying I don't study vote buying, I don't study elections, and so this is purely me making things up. But why not? So there is a very similar finding in the Philippines where some of my co-authors, I wasn't involved in this, but people who I'm friends with, did research on vote buying, and they used almost the same research design as you. They asked some people directly, they used a list experiment with some people, and they used self-enumeration with some people, and the question across the board was, in the last election, did you sell your vote? And just like you, they found almost no difference between the estimate of the list experiment and the estimate of the direct question. And they think that this shows the list experiment doesn't really do anything. I actually think it tells us something about vote buying. My interpretation is places where vote buying is prevalent, and you'll have to tell me, well, so you said in Indonesia about 1 in 4 said yes. In this part of the rural Philippines, it was close to half said they had sold their vote. So my theory is that in places where vote buying is prevalent, it's because it's not taboo, it's not sensitive. It's just part of the culture. You are giving up your vote and you expect something in return. And so why would you admit to it? Of course it makes sense. If you're giving them something, they should give you something. So this is my theory about the Philippines. People are willing to say, yes, I sold my vote, because it's just understood that that's part of elections, and that's part of the value of elections, is that these politicians go around handing out small favors and services around the elections, and that's one of the good things about democracy, is it's a vote point for redistribution. Now, whether or not it's true, I have no idea, but that's my theory.
Interesting. So vote buying is seen as gift giving. Okay, Mas Saiful, pilih dulu ya. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Philip Monte from CSIS. This is not a question, but rather a sharing. I'd like to seek your opinion on this. On the non-response, I think one thing that we can do also is to anticipate, inserting question to anticipate non-response. What I mean is, in 2017, we had a Google comparative governor election in Jakarta. You might have heard about it. And in the runoff, the second round, we ran a survey. I think it was 3 or 4 weeks before the runoff took place. And we did not publish our result because it was strange for us, the result we got. That is, people, when we ask questions, who are you going to vote in the runoff, we we got about 21% of respondents that it's a secret. That's very new to us. And we were confused at that time, but luckily before we ran survey, we inserted one question that is not as direct as that question, that is using the scale. On the scale of 1 to 10, 1 meaning you are absolutely not going to vote for a person, or 10 meaning you are absolutely going to vote. So we had that question for the two candidates. So then when we look at this 21% of non-response, what we did was, first we checked whether our enumerator, played monkey business against us, right? So we got a phone number, we collected the 21%, we looked at the paper, and so on. So we called up, and then one of them I called personally, and it was a lady, and I asked her a question. Did one of our researchers come to your house on this date, and so on? Yes, she said, and then we checked some of the questions, her demography and so on. And then I asked her again that one question. If I may ask you again, who are you going to vote in the runoff? And she scolded me. She said, I told you it's a secret. Right? So, at that time, I was convinced that it is the true number. The 21% of the voters in Jakarta and city at that time did not want to reveal whom they are going to vote. So it would be problematic for us to release the survey, because that 21% would go anywhere, and then in the end it would be blamed if it went against our estimate. Now on that, then the next step, we check the question, that scale. So if they said they are going to vote for candidate A on a range of 6 or above 5, then we treated them as the supporters of candidate A, and the same is true for candidate B. But it would only reduce the number into about 18%. So it's still very big, non-response. Now my question would be, is there any other kind of anticipation that you can think of, that we can insert in the questionnaire itself, in the cases that we've been doing somewhere else?
This is a very interesting problem to have. It didn't immediately occur to me that we should think of it's a secret as non-response, because saying it's a secret is in fact a response, right? That is information. I would answer your question with another question, which is, why won't they tell you? Why is it a secret? And I don't think we can design a solution to make them tell you without knowing why they won't tell you. And so I'm curious, when you called the woman and she said it's a secret, did you ask her why?
That can be a long conversation with her. But, to give a background, there was an election where allegiance and identity come to the fore. And the incumbent at the time was a minority, or minority is non-Muslim, Christian, and Chinese religion. And there were a lot of campaigns, campaigning and so on. So I think it is similar to what happened with Trump supporters in the last presidential election, during which Trump supporters initially refused, I read somewhere, refused to reveal their preference when they were being responded to some surveys. So maybe it's because, maybe it's kind of they are, and this is a reflection for survey institutes in Indonesia, member of the SETI. Maybe the respondents evaluating the institute who are conducting the survey. So they are maybe measuring, maybe you are the supporter of this candidate or that candidate. That's, I think, one of the reasons I think.
Yeah. So in that particular case, I mean, methodologically, the answer would be don't tell them who you are or who's sending the survey. But of course, there are ethical problems with that. You might go the other route and say, hi, we're from this institute. You may have heard of us. Here are some examples of non-partisan, non-political research that we've done previously. Today we're researching this upcoming election, but we do all sorts of research on all sorts of topics. And we don't support one candidate or the other. I do sort of worry though that people view vote choice as a private decision. I know in the United States people often don't want to admit or they don't want to answer questions about who they're going to vote for, and there's no real reason for that. You're not going to get in trouble with anyone. Nobody's going to be mad at you. But still, we have trouble getting people to answer questions about who they'll vote for. It's just cultural, I guess. And when it's viewed that way, I'm not sure there is a solution, right? That falls in the category of people just don't want you to have the information. There may not be a solution other than thinking about their refusal to answer as information in and of itself, right? And then you publish the poll and you say, this many people plan to vote for candidate A, this many people plan to vote for candidate B, this many people say they don't want to say who they're going to vote for, right? And people can draw their own conclusions from that information. And you've done your duty as a researcher to provide us with true, accurate information, which is 21% of people say their vote choice is private.
Ada sedikit pengalaman juga nih, Bro Billy. Di 2012, so in Jakarta 2012, gubernatorial election at the time, many research institutes predicted fraud in the first round of the election, and then many of us just hide not to do surveys ahead of the second round of the election. Then majalah Tempo magazine came to us to challenge us whether we have got to run a survey ahead of the second round of the Jakarta election. And then first we dropped the substitute respondent. That's the first scenario that I think it's really helpful to reduce the number of those who hide their preference. And the second one, what we did is that we look at the demographic of those who still undecided when the survey was conducted, and then we compare the demographic of those who still unsure about their choice with the demographic of the supporters of Foke, Osiko, and Joko Widodo. And as you may know that the supporters of Jokowi tend to come from middle upper class in 2012. And those who voted for Osiko more likely coming from middle lower class. And then the respondent who unwilling to report or unwilling to be interviewed, mostly coming from middle upper class, including those who undecided when the survey was conducted. And then we concluded that many of those who still undecided when the survey was conducted, because many of them coming from middle upper class, more likely to vote for Jokowi rather than Osiko. So sometimes it was helpful to compare between the demographic of those who still unsure about their voting choice with the demographic of particular candidate.
Thank you. But I would like to ask a very simple question. Based on your experience doing research, doing survey in the Middle East, especially how did you, let's say, how did you improve, how did you convince the respondent to participate in the survey, looking at the potential risk or potential risk for them? Because our experience in the survey, we face or we met a number of people who are not willing to answer from the beginning, because we always share the informed consent if they're not willing to answer our question, and then so we drop the respondent. So I would like you to share how we can convince the respondents so that because this is in Indonesia and it's much safer, there is no risk of being retaliated or persecuted, and there should be easier, but still we have a problem of convincing when we are doing survey on religiosity among the population, and still there is some group of Indonesians who resist, who don't want to participate in the survey, despite the fact that they are randomized, they get random in our survey. So that's all. Thank you.
In a sort of counterintuitive sense, it was easier in Iraq to convince people to participate because the risk in Iraq was violence, and it's sort of straightforward to reduce that risk by doing a survey in their house, doing it in a private location, and ensuring them, I'm only going to ask about these topics, I'm only going to ask in a certain way, and your data will be kept completely private. Okay, and if you build trust with your respondent, you can convince them that, no, I really am serious about protecting the data and protecting their privacy. But asking people about religion is more personal, right? And it's not concern about someone coming to your house and beating you up because they don't like the answers you gave. It's that my religion is for me, and it shouldn't be used for political purposes, and I shouldn't have to justify it to anyone else. And I'm just not interested in having a 45-minute conversation with a stranger about my religious beliefs and what I do and don't do, and what I do and don't believe in. In that sense, it's a completely different set of problems than conducting research on violent extremism. I wonder then if maybe in round 2 of this conference, we should separate out violent extremism from religious extremism and talk about the different problems that each source or each type of extremism poses, right? Because as you correctly point out, they are very different. And so that's acknowledging the problem. My suggestion for beginning to solve it is to focus on that specific reason why people won't participate, right? This idea that you're asking them about a personal topic, and you're asking them to share information that we don't normally share with strangers. And so maybe the solution is to use not just local enumerators from Jakarta, but enumerators from that neighborhood. Hire people who are well known in the community. Right? And so it's not some stranger from CSIS knocking on your door. It's Omar from down the street who's knocking on your door. And of course, it becomes more difficult and more expensive to train those enumerators and ensure quality control. But if the alternative is to not get participation at all, it may be worth that trade-off. So that's one thing you might consider.
Masih ada lagi, ini kesempatan luar biasa kita punya Catherine, punya Matthew, karena Mas Anies ya bukan Baswedan, Anies Amin dari USAID, jadi kita punya kesempatan untuk belajar. Gak apa-apa, kalau mau bertanya dalam bahasa Indonesia, ada translatornya di bawah. Masih ada waktu kurang lebih 20-an menit. Dan lagi. Oke, ya Mas. Namanya Mas.
kemudian dari calon menteri pertahanan dalam konvensi. Talking about issues today, we should get some information about the accuracy of the respondent. But sometimes for sensitive question or issue, be like yesterday happened, who want to really honest. When we ask the respondent to assess what this movement or public organization, for example, like this, do you agree or not agree with this public organization or NGO? So some respondents maybe express our question, right? So what do you think? It's one way to which we put the answer on front of the question or is the end of the question. Thank you.
So can you explain a little bit more about, I didn't hear it, like
The movement, the 1 and 2.
Yeah, that's like maybe some radical organization. When we ask about the respondent, do you agree of the existing this organization or just? And when we ask to them, maybe most of them is afraid to answer our question. So this one better to put that the question on item. The opinion of the question.
Okay. So the question is where in the survey you should put the sensitive questions?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good topic. There's no research that I'm aware of on this, meaning I have a suspicion, but I don't actually have data to back it up. So one argument is you put it at the end so that if you upset people with your sensitive question, at least you'll already have asked all the other questions that you want to ask. And so if they get angry and say, no, I'm not answering any more questions, you're already at the end, you haven't lost anything else. Right? And that's also nice because if they do answer, but they get angry and it affects the way they answer other questions, well, if it's at the end, it doesn't matter because there's nothing else afterwards. The other argument, and one other reason to put it at the end, my survey company in Iraq that I work with likes to do it this way. If you start with the easy questions, you build rapport, you build trust between the enumerator and the respondent, and by the time you get to the end, to the sensitive question, they feel like they know each other a little bit more about it. The argument for putting the sensitive question at the beginning is this is probably the question that you're most interested in the entire survey. This is what you really care about. And we know that people lose interest and stop paying attention as the survey goes on and goes on, right? We all have short attention spans. It's the same reason we were all paying very close attention at 9 a.m. this morning. And by the end of the day, we're all going to be thinking, is it time to go home, time to have dinner, right? That it's just human nature. And if you put your most important questions at the end of the survey, that's where people are paying the least attention. They're going to make mistakes, they're not going to care, and they're just going to choose answers at random. And so of course that's a problem. Now, my suspicion is that when we're talking about sensitive items, it's much more important to build that rapport and build that trust between the enumerator and the respondent before getting there. And so it's worth putting it at the end and acknowledging the trade-offs. But it is a trade-off, right? And maybe someone should do a survey where half the time they put a question at the beginning and half the time they put it at the end, and they compare non-response rates between the two. Right? This is one of those questions that, like, we can sit here and debate it till the end of the day, but we could also just go out and test it, right? We have a hypothesis that says people will be more willing to answer if we put the sensitive question at the end. We go test it and we find out. I don't know, maybe there's someone in this room who is interested enough in this question to run a survey and find out.
I have a question, Matthew. How to generate a sampling rate? Like, for example, just to give you a broader background about the 212 movement. So, in 2nd December 2016, there was a massive anti-Ahok demonstration. The Christian and Chinese government of Jakarta, and then there's still a series of demonstrations against him till the local election in April 2017. And now we see a massive demonstration against. They call it Extremism 212. But my question is that how to do a representative survey of those who attended the demonstration, because we don't have a sampling rate, right? Because what is it? The actor of those anti-Ahok demonstration claim that the 212 anti-Ahok demonstration was attended by 7 million, and another one claimed 4 million people. The anti-212 movement just only gives them a number around 600,000, something like that. So there are a lot of different numbers regarding the participants of the anti-Ahok movement. And my question is, I would like to do a representative survey of those who attended the demonstration, but the problem, we don't have the sampling rate. Do you have any comment?
That's really hard. I suspect that the answer is you can't. But you can come close, right? You can do something. And so my intuition would be to start with a representative sample of everyone in Jakarta and ask them basic demographic questions, and then ask them, did you attend the demonstration? And then you can see which types of people attended the demonstration. And then you can target those types of people, and you'll still need to ask a screening question, right? You'll still need to ask at the very beginning of the survey, did you attend the demonstration? But if, let's say in your first survey, your representative survey of everyone in Jakarta, you find that overwhelmingly people who attended the demonstration are from a certain age group and live in a certain neighborhood, then you can target people who are that age and live in that neighborhood. And then, instead of your screening question throwing out 70% of people, it might only throw out 10% of people. And then you start to get closer to what you're looking for. Now, it's hard for me to think of a way to truly get a representative sample of people who attended the demonstration, short of being there, right? Now, another approach might be to start with social media and look at methods of spreading the word that the demonstration was going to take place, and maybe people posted on Twitter that they're going to the demonstration, right? So you can collect all the tweets of people who said they were there and take a random sample of people who tweeted that they were there and try to contact those people. You're going to miss the people who aren't on Twitter, and you're going to miss the people who are like me, who would show up but would never post about it on the internet. And you're going to miss the people who live very close to the demonstration, who might not have planned to go but saw a big crowd outside and went, and so they also didn't post about it on Twitter. Right? But it's another way of thinking about how to get some information about who was the most likely to have been there, and then survey those people. It reminds me, so it's a slightly different version of a question that I see more often on sampling frames, which is if you survey in very poor areas or places with very low government capacity, there's no census to use as a sampling frame. And so, you can do what we call a random walk, where you start your enumerator in a particular place and say, go 5 houses to the north and 3 houses to the west, and then ask the first person who answers the door, right? And then repeat and repeat. And so that is geographically random, but it's very sensitive to the population density in certain areas. And so if you don't have a census knowing how many people live in certain areas, you don't know how many surveys to do and when to stop and move to the next area. And so what someone at the University of California did, he wanted to run a survey in Mogadishu. And of course, the Somali government doesn't do a census of Mogadishu. There's no real data on who lives in which neighborhoods and how many people live where. And so, sure, he could send people knocking on doors, but he didn't know how many surveys to do in each area. So he took satellite imagery of Mogadishu and then realized that the color that was showing up in the satellite image corresponded to the type of material. And so green areas are grass, right? Tan areas are just open fields. But a certain shade of gray corresponds to a metal roof. Another shade of gray corresponds to a concrete roof. And we can make some pretty well-educated guesses about population density in certain areas based on the colors and patterns that show up in the satellite image. And so he was able to figure out roughly the density of the population in each area based on the satellite images, and then use his random walk to select the right number of people in each area. So that doesn't solve your problem, unfortunately, but it's an example of how you can get very creative and create a sampling frame where one doesn't already exist for you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Give him applause. Saya kembalikan ke pembawa acara.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew Haynes, for sharing your insights with us, and thank you, Mr. Montani, for guiding us throughout the discussion. Sekarang saya undang kembali Dr. Kirsten Monte untuk menyampaikan kesimpulan sebelum acara ini. Kepada Dr. Monte, kami persilakan untuk naik ke atas panggung.
Terima kasih ya di sini. Bapak Ibu, teman-teman semuanya, terima kasih sudah hadir di acara ini. Teman-teman Persepi, mudah-mudahan mendapatkan manfaat sama seperti yang saya rasakan dalam diskusi kali ini. And special thanks to Matthew and Christine who agreed to fly far away from the US to Indonesia. I know Matt has some personal reason, that is to escape from the cold winter in the US and finding a warm weather here in Jakarta, and I understand they're going to Bali next week, tomorrow. And then I hope you enjoy the time here in Jakarta, dan safe flight back home. And buat teman-teman Persepi yang akan kembali ke daerah masing-masing, saya juga ucapkan selamat jalan, safe flight. Dan teman-teman yang hadir, ada beberapa yang sudah melakukan survei tapi belum jadi anggota Persepi, silakan mendaftar jadi anggota Persepi. Mas ya, kompas kayak belumnya. Terima kasih, dan saya ingin mengucapkan terima kasih juga ini pada ini yang mengurus adalah yang pertama Arya Fernandez, ini kasih applause dan juga teman-teman di CSIS yang membuat live streaming. Ada link YouTube-nya, kalau mau ditonton lagi bisa, nanti kita bisa share, dan sampai ketemu di event Persepi atau event CSIS yang berikutnya. Terima kasih, selamat sore, assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
we must